event that took place over 72 years ago. For almost everybody here before. And it's still remembered. And it changed the face of the land and it changed the culture of New Jersey's Bayshore. We'll be learning about that. And then we'll be also learning about some of the challenges and issues on the Maurice Cove today. With erosion, subsidence of the land, climate-caused sea level rise, all these things that are impacting that amazing part of our state. We are so lucky to have with us tonight Rachel Dohansik, who is the curator of the Delaware Bay Museum at the Bayshore Center at Bivalve. Rachel has been a museum curator for 15 years and has been the curator at Bivalve since 2010.
Might be more than 15 years at this point.
Oh, it's definitely over 15.
So long.
No, when we started planning.
Yeah, maybe it was 15 years then.
Rachel earned a BA in history from Wheaton College in Massachusetts and an MA in museum education from the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. Most of her professional career has been in museums along the Jersey waterfronts or in the Chesapeake Bay region. And in 2004, she received a special award of recognition from the New Jersey Historical Commission for outstanding service to public knowledge and preservation of New Jersey's history. So I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Rachel Dohansik and the Tidal Wave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, that was probably one of the nicest introductions. Thank you. Right, so I'm Rachel, and we were saying before that it's probably about 2.5 years ago when Rich first reached out about doing a presentation, and we're like, oh, in the spring of 2020. So here we are, a couple of years later. Originally, though, the presenter would have been Drew Tomlin. Drew is one of the authors of the Tidal Wave book and also helped put together the presentation. Unfortunately, he passed away right before Christmas time, and I know he knew about this presentation, and he always, loved giving this talk. So I'm going to be pinch hitting for Drew. So as was mentioned, I'm with the Bayshore Center at Bivalve. I know a couple of you have already mentioned you've been down that way and come to events there. So it's not too far away, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But we're a nonprofit. We're an environmental history museum with a mission to look at how humans impact the environment. So we're not just an environmental organization, but because we have the history aspect and the artifacts, we can look at the human side of things. We do that through our museum and then also through the schooner A.J. Nearwall, which is also New Jersey's official tall ship. It's just a title, there's no funding with that. It's a nice title that we have. And I did bring along with me 2 free tickets to sail on the Nearwall, and I thought at the end I could either ask a trivia question or something and give away 2 tickets. They don't expire. The only issue right now is that the A.J. Nearwall is in Maine, undergoing our 2nd restoration. So we won't exactly have a sailing season this year because we don't have a boat. We actually don't have a captain at the moment, but we will be sailing again at some point, and I will, like I said, they don't expire. So if you haven't been for a sail, pre-COVID, we'd sail around the state, and starting next year, we'll resume that. We do sail out of our home port at Bivalve, but we also sail from Burlington and Bristol in the past, Cape May, Atlantic Highlands, Beach Haven, places like that. So basically any port. So I have to think of a good, or we'll think of a good trivia question to ask at the end. So the presentation, one other thing. Usually what I like to do is do a quick 360-degree tour of our facility using Google, but since I was told you don't have internet access, if you do check out our website, bayshorecenter.org, and then you'll click on museum information, you can scroll down and you can see how you can do like a 360 tour. You can actually walk out on our wharves, walk out to the Maurice River, see the boat, turn around, come back, and you can even enter our building and our museum as well. So be sure to check that out or just come and visit us. All right, So I'm going to start off with the Tidal Wave book. I'll be reading some excerpts from the actual book. I did bring copies with me, so if you'd like to read more about it and help support the Bayshore Center, the books are $20. That includes tax. So after the presentation, you can come check that out. Okay, so a really quick history of the Delaware Bay. Of course, from where we are down the Delaware River to the Delaware Bay is when you'll get to Bivalve. So I know Drew really wanted to put this in the presentation to say, well, 20,000 years ago, the bay did not exist. It was a freshwater river, far offshore. Of course, as we know, glaciers covered much of North America. The ocean was up to 90 miles off the coast, and sea level was much lower, under 400 feet lower. So 10,000 years ago, the bay as we know it starts to form. The mouth of the bay was about 3 miles wide at that point. Of course, it's 16 miles wide today. Seas are still lower, just under 100 feet. And then, of course, there's going to be a rapid rise in sea level due to the melting of the glaciers. And then 5,000 years ago, it gets even closer to how we know the bay today. You're starting to get islands and shoals. 60% of the bay exists. The rise of the water is starting to settle out as well. And actually this part here doesn't belong there, subsidence and human activity. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So these are the three authors who wrote Tidal Wave. I mentioned Drew. He's the one who really wanted to see this put together because he grew up in Leesburg in Cumberland County, and he was born in the mid-1940s, and he'd always had heard about the storm. And he was about 4 years old, I think, when the storm happened. And so he knew that there were still old-timers around, people older than, in their 90s who were still around to tell the story. And he kind of kept like pestering us at work about we need to talk to these people. And he started doing some oral history interviews, and then in 2000, I think it was 18, Joanne, who's the woman in the middle, was our intern and took care of the museum, and Drew mentioned it to her, and she had volunteered or interned at the Millville Army Airfield Museum and had interviewed veterans, so she really enjoyed doing oral history interviews. And then since she had more of a humanities background, she brought in her friend Ashley, who had an environmental science background. And so the three of them together did this book. And so I would say it was like the three, you never would match them all together. But for over a year, they all worked together to make this happen. So, and Joanne and Ashley are still, around and in touch. So the Great Appalachian Storm of 1950, that's the official title, was November 22nd to the 30th, and was considered to be one of the biggest weather events in the U.S. Because it wasn't just affected here in New Jersey, but in other parts of the country as well. From Maine to Florida, and then New Jersey to Ohio, with 383 deaths total. Lots of power outage, and $700 million in damage nationwide. And from what I understand, and I'm not a scientist, but it's I'll talk about it in a minute, it was the pressure, the extreme pressure difference and its odd direction that made the storm so powerful. And the neat thing about the book is we do have quite a few copies of newspaper clippings and headlines from the local papers, especially from like Vineland, Millville, Bridgeton. So that's a nice thing that Drew and Joanne actually did a little more digging to find more information. But most of the stories in the book are all based on those oral history interviews and those first-hand accounts. So it was an extratropical cyclone. Low pressure formed in the center of the storm, high pressure is on the outside, and this caused these extremely high winds. So it wasn't a hurricane And it's called, all the locals call it a tidal wave, which I'll explain why they call it a tidal wave, even though it was not a tidal wave, it was not a tsunami, officially. But I'm sure everyone felt that it was. Let's see here. So what everyone talks about is how prior to the storm, there had been strong northwest wind for 3 days, and that caused a blowout tide, meaning that the water was really, really low. And it was out. I mean, once in a while, we'll still see that in Bivalve, where like our wharves, you'll just see the mud, you know, all the way to the edge. But from what I understand, this was really extreme with a blowout tide because the winds had just pushed the water out. And as you can see here, the height of the high tide only came to the height of the normal low tide. So that's how extreme it was. Then the wind changes, and it starts coming from the southeast, which of course is always a problem, and pushed ahead of it a wall of water, which coincided with the high tide. And I'm sure that you all know the stories of the storm of 62, you know, however many high tides it hit, that was the issue here. So that is why the locals call it a tidal wave, because the water was very far out and then came in. As you can see in the bottom portion here, it goes into more technical terms about what a tidal wave actually is and what a tsunami is. But again, that wasn't our situation here. It was just a very bad storm. So here's our quick geography lesson, but I'm sure you're all very familiar with the geography of New Jersey. Cumberland County, down in the southwest corner of the state. Raise your hand if you've been to Bivalve or Cumberland County and you're familiar? Oh, good. Okay, great. I mean, we're not too far away from here. So the Maurice River. If I do this, will this show up on here? Ah, yes. So here's the Maurice River, pronounced Morris, not Maurice. There's Bivalve up here. And then some of these other communities really no longer exist. Shellpile, Maurice River, Mass Landing somewhat does. Port Norris, that's town. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Morristown. They did the nice Christmas house tour. Dorchester and Leesburg over on the other side of the river. The AJ Muir Wall was built in Dorchester, and there's still several shipyards. In fact, even today, the river is still very active. Like I said, there's several shipyards up the river. You'll see large, even like the Cape May Lewis Ferry on occasion, getting towed up the river for repairs. There's a large sand loading operation where trucks come and load these massive barges there right up. Actually, it's technically, I think, Shellpile, and then get shipped out. It's still an active waterfront. You'll still see oystermen and crabbers, the Marine State Police. So it's still a neat place. So when you come to our museum, even though it's like a throwback in time, it's still an active waterfront at the same time. The Maurice River Cove is this section here. I'm sure you're familiar with East Point Lighthouse. That's out here on the point. And this area is where they traditionally would plant oysters. In the spring of the year, what guys used to do is go up to points off of Fortescue, dredge up the baby oysters from their boats, sail back down the bay, and then they would dump them off on their leased grounds, the bottom of the bay. And the reason why they did that was because this area was warmer water, higher salinity, and the oysters would grow faster, they would get that nice salty taste. And there's still actually some guys that still put oysters on their grounds. And there's also oyster farmers, and that's a whole other talk, but just thought I'd mention that this very famous area. This is your oyster area. In the talk, I'll talk a little bit about Thompson's Beach and Moore's Beach, which of course are no longer developed. Many of you have been out to those beaches, birding and taking pictures, so yeah. So it's a really pretty area. So, unlike today, being 1950, no warning about what was going to happen. It was really when the water started coming in. And I'll show pictures of the houses coming off their foundations. Drew and Joanne actually interviewed 10 people for this, and some of them have multiple stories. Some of them have just like their one family story, and some have like many stories over those couple of days. And these are the folks who were interviewed for the book. Jack Stillman, who's this fellow here, he's since then passed away. He was like third generation owner of a shipyard, Stillman Brothers, in Dorchester, which is where the Aging Year Wall was built. Let me see, that seemed like it was, okay. So Thompson's Beach, at one time had, I think the official number I heard was something like 107 houses, or more like cottages and cabins. People would go there for the weekend, for the summer. You may have heard as the other shore or the hidden shore. And the story for Thompson's Beach, I was going to read you an excerpt here, was from Mary Ann Klein Beggs. Her grandfather actually owned Captain Klein's. They rented boats and he would sell bait. He had like a general store. Her grandfather unfortunately passed away during the storm, and there's a story about that. She was just an infant. So the story she tells is what her parents told her. So she says, I imagine that water was rising pretty quick. When it comes up fast, but with the storm, even more so. My parents and I were in our bungalow at Thompson's Beach. My dad had to get on the bureau and broke through the ceiling so we could climb into the attic. Mom got up first, Dad handed me to her, and then he came up. Eventually, the house broke apart and we floated along in the attic. They were afraid they were going to drown because the house was caught in the electric lines that came into the house. Those electric lines kept the attic from floating away, so you could just imagine like their house isn't moving. So somehow this is funny part. So Dad got a big iron skillet somewhere up there in the attic, and he hit the wires. When he did that, he hit his head with the pan and made a big gash. Once he broke the wires, we could at least float. Otherwise, it may have gone under. Then we floated over to East Point. So that was her recollection. And then it goes into more detail about how they were rescued and so forth. But I know I went along in that interview, and of course she has no idea what this like iron skillet was doing in the attic. But luckily, I guess there's a reason that you put stash stuff in your attic. So Olin W. Newcomb and Barney Hollinger. This is Barney as a younger guy. Barney's still around. He's probably about 93 or so now. His family's been in the oyster business for a long time, and they still are. Their oyster business is now part of Cape May Salt Oyster Company. So Barney, he talks about, let's see here. What's funny about Barney is that his real name is Warrington, and his nickname is Barney. And his son's name is Warren, and his nickname is Barney. Named after a family friend. So Barney was out oystering and out on the boat, out on the Olin W. Newcomb. Of course, by this time, let's see, it's 1950. So at this point, they're no longer working under sail, they're working under power. And he says, as we were coming in, all the land we would use for navigating was underwater. All the docks were under, but you could still see the shell piles. Almost everywhere you look, there was water. We had to use compass, horses, dead reckoning, and our experience to make it back to Bivalve safely. It took about an hour to get from the oyster grounds to Bivalve, and that was that Maurice River Cove area. After making it back in Bivalve, we went to FF East and Stoneman shucking houses in Maurice River. We grabbed about 50 people who had made it out to get on the boat and brought them back to Port Norris. We weren't able to return to oystering for about a week. It took a few days for the water to recede because the water didn't flush out all at once. It was like a slow drain out of the marsh. There were no new cuts or ditches made. Houses and other things floated away in different areas. And like I said, this is 1950, and Barney's still around today. You'll see him just driving over, checking things out, keeping an eye on his sons and other people still working in the oyster industry. Here's another picture of Thompson's Beach. You can see all the houses that got moved around. And so it really gives you a better sense of Mary Ann as a baby with her parents in the attic floating across the marsh. This is a really neat story. This is probably one of Drew's favorite stories. Well, he had many favorite stories, but one of his favorite stories about East Point Lighthouse and the Explorer Scouts. It was like a similar to Boy Scouts. And in this instance, Drew had come across a newspaper clipping about, as they were called, the Boy Scout kids, because it didn't say they were Explorer Scouts. And he's reading the article, and he realizes that he recognizes two of the names. Just from guys he's known over the years. And it turns out these two friends of his, who he's known forever, were two of the boys who were stuck in the lighthouse during the storm. So it was really neat because he was, lined them up to come back to the lighthouse and tell their story and take pictures. And that was a really neat day. So this is, let's see, I can tell you. I can't find the page for, oh, here it is. Okay. So this is Bob France and Frank Casaboon. Frank is this boy here. That's Frank, who tells the story. And Bob is, oops, this kid right here, just poking his head around. And of course, here's an earlier picture of East Point Lighthouse. So what's interesting about them, they spent the weekend in the lighthouse alone, without any adults. And the whole reason their troop leader had arranged for them to spend the weekend in the lighthouse, at that point, there was no longer a lighthouse keeper. There was some sort of custodian who didn't live there. And the deal was that they could stay there, but they had to do some painting and other chores. So these kids got left alone all weekend long in the lighthouse with the storm coming. And so they say, we had old army beds and we brought our own sleeping bags. We divided up the space of the bedrooms on the second floor. We were all sleeping and somebody, I don't remember who, got up and looked out the window. He noticed there was water rising and he woke us all up. Where I was sleeping, I had the fireplace to my left and there were windows straight ahead of me. There was a flagpole outside the windows. It wasn't far from the building, but I was using that for my gauge as to how high the water was coming in. There was a space between the building and the flagpole. We were wondering what was going on. One of the fellows had a transistor radio. He turned it on and got the news, so we knew we were in a tidal wave. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known what was going on. I was seeing houses from Thompson's Beach floating by. I had a BB gun and I was shooting out the windows, out the window lights. We weren't going anywhere. And it's funny because there was a house floating by with the door open. You could see the kitchen table with a vase of flowers on it. The whole house had just lifted up and it was like a boat. It didn't disturb anything in the house at all. Eventually, they are rescued. A bit later. So they had an interesting weekend that never forgot. Here's a photo of downtown Port Norris, which, we flood a lot in Bivalve, but Port Norris, tends not to get water, but they did during the storm. This is Miss Mildred Green. She was a shucker. She worked in the oyster house in Maurice River, the village of Maurice River. This is Bivalve over here to the left, and we operate at a part of this building which was built in 1903 by the Central Railroad Company in New Jersey for the sole purpose of packing and shipping out oysters. And this picture's from around 1930, so it's a little bit before Mildred's time, but it gives you a sense of the operation of shipping out the oysters and all the boats that were involved. So Mildred worked over here in Maurice River. There were, as one time, as what they called them, shanties, where the shuckers lived and their families. And then during her time, there were a couple of shucking houses, or oyster houses. So what she remembers, or part of what she remembers, is it was a bad day that day. I would say it was bad for 2 days, rainy and windy. I was working in the shucking house, and some other shuckers came over and said, "Mildred, you better go get your kids." Well, I went down there to get my husband, and I said, "We should get out of here," because we were right by the riverbank. So by the time I got down there to my house and got the children up, oh man, all hell broke loose. We came down, and everyone was either going in the oyster house upstairs or in somebody's room upstairs because the water was high. It was in the shanties, houses downtown. My shanty was all the way down at the end, and then you had water running through the bank that was underneath the oyster houses. It was coming from the river. And then she talks about 2 shuckers from Philadelphia who start running down to her house. And she said, I had my 6-month-old baby in my arms, and my husband, he had the 2 other kids. I was just fixing to go under when one of the fellows from Philadelphia came to my rescue and said, "Come on, Miss Mildred, grab me." And he pulled me up by the hair of my head. One put his arm around my waist and brought me up. The other one grabbed my husband and the kids. If that one fella hadn't grabbed me by the top of my hair, and I had hair in those days, and pulled me up, I would have drowned. So she's quite the lady. And what's kind of funny about Miss Mildred is, when I sit there, I said, "Oh, so you have 3 children?" And she's like, no. She's like, "I have 9. I'm like, "Oh," but during that time she had 3. And I said, "Oh, 9. And she's like, "Well, there's nothing else to do after 8 o'clock, but they whoopee." And Drew said I turned like beet red. And Drew loved to tell that story about how Miss Mildred, I wasn't expecting that from the sweet little old lady. So, all right, Fortescue. The story of Fortescue, or one of the stories, is from Arlene Hornsharp. She's 10 years old during their storm, and she's there with her mom. Other family members, like her dad and grandparents, weren't there. And I forget why they were there by themselves. Well, it was the Saturday after Thanksgiving. I guess her dad was working, and maybe they had gone down there just to do things, or perhaps close things up for winter. And her and her mom end up going to her grandparents' house when the water starts coming in, because they felt that was a better house, a more secure house to be in. And she talks a bit about their rescue. And she says that when the Salvation Army came into town, they must have said, "Better go down further, the horns are down there." And she says, "We were sitting in the back of the truck on a wooden plank. Everybody was crying and shaking. The Salvation Army took us to Bridgeton, and they were absolutely wonderful to us. They gave us blankets, dry clothes, food, everything. But my dad and brother could not find us. They had no idea where we were, whether the rescuers took us to Millville, Vineland, Bridgeton, or up the road. So it wasn't until the next afternoon that they finally found us in Bridgeton at the Salvation Army. All the buildings were destroyed except for Grandma and Grandpa's. That was the only one. If it wasn't for Grandma and Grandpa's house and my mother having the intelligence to move the 2 of us over there and leave the door open, I wouldn't be here today. Because the water just came in and swished around. It didn't make a bubble inside the house to pick it up. My grandparents' house did have a concrete foundation. It was the only house down there that had one." So that's a little bit. And like I said, then she talks more about the storm and the aftermath as well. The Owens family, this is a really sad story. 4 of the siblings, as you can see, ages 2, 6, 7, and 11, Clarence, Arthur, Jerry, and Betty May, were killed during the storm. Their parents survived. And after the book was published, a man contacted us who, I guess somebody had told him about the book, or they knew he had some sort of connection to Moores Beach. And here he was the younger sibling who was born after the storm. And he knew that he had 4 older siblings, but he knew nothing about them, and really didn't know what had happened. He heard there was some sort of terrible thing that happened, but his parents never talked about the storm. He had no idea. And it was because of this book that he could actually learn the story from the accounts of other people as to what happened to his older siblings that he never knew. So when we found that out, I was like, oh, all the aggravation and irritation and putting the book together, that really made it all worth it. So that was a really cool thing to come out of it, for this man to finally learn what happened to his family. And there's more detail in here too about those kids. So on a lighter note, Herbert and Nancy, there's a newspaper account where the two of them are talking about the storm and their ordeal, and then she's quoted as saying, "I even got mud in my false teeth." Which, of course, if you've been down that way, you know how muddy it is, and it just gets stuck to you. So that's a fun story. Another story that we talk about is another Morris Beach house. And as I mentioned, a lot of the houses floated off their foundations and into the meadows. So of course, you're not going to leave the house to waste or let it rot out there. You're going to go out there and get your house. So this is one of the people who, I forget how Drew came across this family, but they were able to supply photographs and memories of that time. And here they are, bringing the house back up on the road. And here's the house. It's actually still there. Of course, this is an older photograph, but it's was moved to Delmont, further inland. I understand, I don't know how many houses were moved, but I've heard different local people say, oh, well, that's a storm house. And if it's a storm house, that means they hauled it out and brought it inland to like Heislerville or Delmont, put it on a new foundation, and you're good to go. So, actually, if you drive around that area, you could probably pick them out, knowing that they were cottages or cabins. And these are the folks who were lost during the storm, at least the ones who we could determine through newspaper accounts or through people's memories. And you can see a mix of ages, a mix of places where they were from. Some people were living locally, other people were living, further inland like Vineland or Glassboro, and of course would have been visiting or spending time down the river. So part of the reason why we put the book together, in addition to documenting these stories that would have been lost otherwise, of course, as we know, it's just looking at history and the lessons it has to teach us and the insights of people's experiences. Makes one think a bit more about natural disasters and being prepared, especially when flooding continues to be an issue and storms continue to be an issue. And also, the ongoing issue, of course, as you all know, about how us humans are always trying to tame nature and make it work for us, make her work for us, which we know doesn't work well. And also the poor housing practices, especially in the towns like Shellpile and Maurice River, where the oyster houses were, where the shuckers were, who were primarily African American, lived in terrible living conditions. Of course, a big buzzword today is about environmental injustice and where poor people live and where their housing is put. And this is a picture of one of the shanties that Miss Mildred was talking about. So that's the end of that presentation, and I'm going to show some pictures since you asked me to do a little bit. Do you have any questions you want to, or comments?
Yes, you mentioned the Boy Scouts.
Yes.
The Explorer Scouts were part of Boy Scouts up until 1979.
Ah.
I was an Eagle Scout and an Explorer Scout. It was part of the progression.
Oh, okay.
In 1979, Explorer Scouts remained part of the Boy Scouts, but broke off and became like Explorer Posts or police department and that. But back then, it was part of the progression. So prior all the way back to 1908, the Explorers were part of the Boy Scouts.
Okay. Are there still Explorers today?
Yes, but they've become specialized. They're part of the Boy Scouts, but it's a post like maybe a police department. There's Natural Explorer Post, which is just Boy Scouts that are And then the uniforms broke off and became Venture Scouts, which the ladies were invited, young women were invited as part of the Boy Scouts, and this was before the women and the girls are invited as part of the Boy Scouts, but it's been progression. But when next time you mention that, Explorer Scouts, so they were all Boy Scouts.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, because the way Drew told me, he thought it was completely different, so good to know. It sounds like you could do a whole presentation on the history of Boy Scouts, or maybe you have.
What is the link with Appalachian?
Oh, the Great Appalachian, because from where it tracked, it followed the Appalachian Mountains. It was an inland storm, you know, up that way. So that's why, yeah, the Great Appalachian Storm in 1950. Any other
I'm
questions?
looking at the Google Maps. I'm trying to pick out Maurice River, the town of Maurice River. There is, did you say that doesn't exist anymore? That was right across from the Bayshore Center?
Yes, yeah, and now you'll just see there's pilings there and marsh. Up until,
Oh, I do see that. So you could take Matt's Landing Road all the way out to that?
yeah, they have it, at Matt's Landing, the road is blocked off now. And I think, we were out there not too long ago, Jeff, but it looked like maybe you could
Yeah, you
walk
used to be
it
able
for
to
a
drive
while.
around the whole thing, I mean, they have it.
Yeah, but I think you could.
It still is a great drive, it's beautiful.
But you could try to walk it. I'm not sure how far you could get before it would get to, you know, until you start to lose land. But basically you're following the railroad right away at that point. Because across the river, that was serviced by the West Jersey Railroad, part of the Pennsylvania Railroad system. So that's the other incredible thing, is that you had two major railroads on either side of the river shipping out oysters all over the country. So, yeah, so you could try and see how far you can get.
Oh, that's interesting. All the times we've been there. I do see that on the map.
Yeah, there was a fire later on in the 1950s that burned down the shucking houses, and after that, that was pretty much the end of Maurice River.
Huh. But that's where the town was, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, a village. Although there was a boarding house there, and there were a couple of like summer cottages, and you had like the shucking houses and then the shanties. Alright. Then the other piece, I wasn't going to do the full presentation, but there's some interesting photographs to show you here. Was another also Drew was involved with, because he got really interested in looking at old maps and aerial photographs. So I'm going to skip ahead to the aerial photos. There we go. So here we are in Bivalve, 1931, and you can see at this point there's still, you know, you can see, make out here the buildings that make up Maurice River, the shucking houses. You can see the railroad line coming around this way. And you can see this nice bend or the reach of the river coming out here to the Maurice River Cove. Although even as early as 1931, you're starting to see this section here starting to, this is Northwest Reach, I forgot the name of it. But you can see that it's already starting to erode away, because originally this would have been connected to the mainland there. There, wants to circle it now. Oh, okay. So then, a little bit more than 20 years later, you can see how the area of Maurice River is starting to have greater flooding going on, and losing a lot more of the marsh there. Not too much changes, a little bit in this reach here, and there's also starting to be in this area a bit of erosion going on. Then skip forward, not quite another 10 years. You can see how this reach continues to erode away. And this piece here is Basket Flats. Or did I get that wrong? Basket Flats, I'm pretty sure, is that's where in the winter time when the river would freeze over, they used to offload the oysters at Basket Flats. So they couldn't make it all the way into Bivalve because of the ice. And of course the harvest season would have been during the winter months, traditionally the months with R's in it, which is September through April, with the height of the season being around Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's. They would offload the oysters closer to the bay. And we have a really cool photograph, actually a postcard of them doing that with a team of horses getting ready to haul the oysters in. And then when you get to 1981, you can really see the area starting to erode even more. You can still see remnants here of Maurice River, what would have been the rail line. You can see how much of this area is filling in with water. The continued erosion here, Basket Flats, and the continuing disappearance of this section here. And then just a few years, a little bit more than a decade later, you can really see the difference there of the way the water's taken over what was the Maurice River Village area, Basket Flats, and then this reach here is just this little tuft of grasses coming up. So traditionally the guys, when they would have left Bivalve to go out to the bay, they would have had to go down and around and come out over here. Now when the Meerwald sails out, because this section is even further eroded, you basically just sail straight out. And East Point Lighthouse is over here. You can see the some of these like raised berms here where you used to be able to drive out on, and some of them you still can. I'm not sure which one is, but it's still pretty to try to maneuver out there and check things out. And then here's a more recent photo from 2006. And again, you can see how the erosion has continued and accelerated over that time. And this is something that we put together because people who had grown up along the river had seen the river change so much in their own lifetime. It wasn't something that was 100 years ago or 200 years ago changed, but just them being on the river or playing in the marshes had seen it change so much. And that's why putting together these photographs, just from a history standpoint, was something everyone was kind of interested in. Let's see. And then here's even a more recent 2015 of those changes. Where we are in Bivalve, we do experience a lot of flooding of our wharves, the wharves that go over the river. We flood on average 7 days a month. So whenever we plan programming, we got to take a look at the tide chart, and if it's around anywhere near 7 feet, we start to think, let's change the date because it's gonna start coming over the wharfs. And I don't know if you were over there for a second Friday when the water starts. I mean, if it times out right, it's a good way to close out, a program because the water's coming in. It's like, okay, everyone go home. But unfortunately, when the wharfs flood, we had a lot of mud. So then our facilities manager then has to spend many hours power washing the wharfs to get the mud off. If we have an event coming right away, if not, letting it dry and then brushing it off works too. But generally, we have something upcoming, so they need to be power washed right away. I recently learned from Rutgers Paskin Lab, from their director, they're also in Bivalve, which is really amazing that you have scientists that come from all around the country to study, all around the world really, to study shellfish in Bivalve at Rutgers Paskin Shellfish Laboratory. So their director had mentioned that he had learned that when the wharfs that go over the river were first built, they were built 1 foot above the highest high tide. So now we flood, like I said, 7 days out of the month because we've lost all this protection. Now the bay can just come right on in. It doesn't have those reaches slowing up the wave action. And so there's your comparison of 1931 and 2015. I thought I had a more recent photo of that. I'll have to check that out later. So, but it's, well, I'll say more about that. I'll point out East Point Lighthouse, since that was a story here in the Tidal Wave book. I'm sure you're all familiar with the flooding that, or the issue of East Point Lighthouse, losing their protection of land from the bay. You can see in the photo on the left is where East Point was back in 1940 and how much more protected it was. Here's the Delaware Bay here, and here's the Maurice River coming in. And here's a picture from 2018 with, again, that erosion accelerating. And of course, the lighthouse, the Friends group that runs it had received funding from the New Jersey Historic Trust, who at the Bayshore Center, we've also received funding from the Historic Trust for the restoration of the aging muir wall and the restoration of our shipping sheds building. So here you have one state agency, has poured a lot of money into the restoration of the lighthouse, but the lighthouse, you have a Friends group running it, the township's involved, they take care of the parking lot area and the road. The Coast Guard, of course, is involved because it's an active light, and then the buildings and the grounds are owned by Fish and Game. So it takes a lot to make anything happen as part of the struggles they're having. It's just there's so many agencies and governments involved. Thompson's Beach area talked about, the picture on the left you can see pre the 1950 storm, all the cottages that were in Thompson's Beach. And of course the photo on the right you already saw. And of course Thompson's Beach today has been put back to nature. And then we talk about, of course, the big question is, well, why should you care? Especially if you don't see it happening immediately, where you live. But of course, if you're out birding or taking pictures, you do see this happening. Like I said, there's places where people used to live that are completely gone now because of the erosion. Of course, with erosion, you get increase of flooding. It hurts the oyster industry because oysters need the right salinity and the right water temperature. They're a lot like humans that way. They like it just so. So when you do have an increase of salinity because the storm's coming in, it pushes more salt water in. The oysters don't like that. If you have a storm that pushes fresh water into the bay and it comes down, then you get too much of that fresh and it offsets the balance. Of course, you talk about the soil, the saltwater intrusion, as I just mentioned. I know we all know about Phragmites and how terrible they are. When you come to Bivalve, across the street from us, I'm sure if you've all been there, there's that wonderful walk that PSE&G put in to offset the nuclear power plant. But they did restore the wetlands and put in the native grasses. So I know that when we have school groups, it's really cool to see what it should look like on this end, and then if you look closer to the road, what it looked like with the invasive Phragmites and other grasses. So Thompson's Beach is no longer with us. Money Island is going away. I think pretty much the last of the people who were still living there, including our founding director, has sold to the state, to Blue Acres, and have left Money Island. Seabreeze, there's a few houses there. Morris Beach is gone. Fortescue is still hanging in there, and Andrews Beach. Of course, Newport and Dividing Creek are further inland, and they're more populated. And it's, especially along like the Bayshore region, there's two sides. There's the people, of course, who think, well, the houses should have been built there to begin with, put it back to how it was, use that Blue Acres money, again, put it back to nature. And then, of course, there's a flip side of people who say, well, it's part of the heritage and the culture of the area. My family has lived here for 300 years, and now it's because of erosion and sea level rise, it's disappearing, and the state's putting no funding into it. So like you don't ask like Atlantic City to move to Absecon, and that's what you're asking people here. They need to leave and move in because it's much about economics. And what's also interesting is in the marshes, there's like these old hunting and fishing cabins that used to be very, very popular. But now the rule is that once those little cabins like fall over, or they get to a point where you just can't do basic repairs, they can no longer be, they can't be rebuilt. So once they're gone, that will be something else that will lose a heritage time period of muskrat trapping, and, fishing, and so forth. I'm going to skip this for a second. But it's not all doom and gloom. The American Littoral Society is getting, they've been pushing, I'm sure you've probably had folks from there speak here before. But starting this year, after many, many years of discussion and planning, the Maurice River is getting dredged, 24 miles at 7 feet deep. It's actually been 25 years since the last time it was dredged, and I mentioned how active the river is. Their goal is to provide protection from the rising water and the erosion of the wetlands. They're going to be doing different types of construction. So I mentioned like basket flats, that's going to get rebuilt with natural oyster reefs and rock mussel beds and other barriers to help slow up the waters from the bay coming in. I got ahead of myself. So the first thing is looking at the basket flats, which, as I said, is currently open to the bay, and they're going to be helping put that reach back in. And then Northwest Reach is that section across from Bivalve. And as you can see here, it says the increase in the amount and frequency of waves to the Northwest Reach, resulting in a half-mile wide swath of shallow open water where there's once healthy tidal wetlands. So restoring those wetlands and making them so they can better do their job is very important. And then finally, they're actually going to be using the dredge spoils from the river and redepositing them back on the shore. And I was recently contacted by an archaeologist who's involved with that project because, of course, before they start dumping dredge spoils, they need to explore what's there. So he was very interested in documenting, which has been an ongoing project actually, but making sure that any what we call shipwrecks are documented and what's where and so forth. Because one thing oystermen used to do is when they wanted to get out of the oystering industry, they would just put their boats up on the banks. So they just go, we put them up on the banks, and that's where they would put their boats, and then they would just kind of go back to nature. Although sometimes they would actually reuse them, which is a whole other another story. So there's a lot going on in the river. There's good news. So up until, like I said, a couple of years ago, it was very like doom and gloom, like, oh, the river is just disappearing beneath us or alongside us. And of course, as like with your club here, I'm sure there's many things that you discuss and talk about. And that's why having these various nonprofits are really important to keeping these issues in the forefront and really pushing to make change. And lastly, I'm going to give an advertisement to, even though I'm talking about all this flooding and we don't have a boat, we don't have a captain, but we still have a lot going on. Especially, this is for last second Friday, April 8th. But April through September, every second Friday during those months, from 4 to 8:30. We have a party out on our wharfs. We have an oyster raw bar, beer and wine. We have food trucks that come out, and music, and you can just enjoy an evening along the Maurice River. And it's a really neat thing. Our museum's open, and it's just a really nice event. We generally have a speaker and some vendors as well. And then in October, instead of doing the second Friday in October, we're going to have the first New Jersey Oyster Festival, and it's going to be a bit like if you were into like a wine tasting festival, but instead of wine or beer, there will be oyster growers and purveyors from around the state who will be there with their oysters, and you can sample them and vote for your favorite. There'll be a shucking contest. We'll have other food too, in case you don't like oysters, but if you just want to come on out and celebrate the oyster. And we'll have speakers like Barney Hollinger, the son of Barney, who was in this book, will be talking about the state of the oyster industry. He's on the Shellfish Council, always has a lot of good information. Rutgers is most likely going to have an open house, so you can go over and see what the scientists are doing with their shellfish research. So it should be a nice time there. And then of course, right now our museum is open. We just reopened for the season. We're open Fridays and Saturdays, noon till 5. And then starting June 1st, we'll be open Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, noon to 5 as well. And eventually when we get our boat back, we'll return to doing public sales, probably more so next year, public sales, and we do education sales with school groups. Of course, we haven't done that in the past couple of years. We also, different groups charter the boat, so if as an organization you're interested in chartering the boat and making an event for yourself, it's something you can certainly do as well. So I think that's all I have is. So any questions or comments? Oh, no questions.
When was the dredging supposed to start?
This year. I don't know the exact start date. But
Like this summer?
This summer, I think, yeah. Yeah.
And how long will it last?
I want to say at least a good year, or maybe 18 months, I read somewhere.
How far up the river are they gonna?
How far up is 24 miles?
24?
24 miles, but I don't know how far that gets you.
I don't know.
In fact, someone asked me that the other day, and I meant to try to figure that out more, of how far it is. Yeah.
All the erosion you talk about is natural erosion, very little man, as compared to other places where it's like it's total human destruction.
Right. I guess you could call it, yeah, natural in that sense, because it hasn't been developed. It's not like it. One of the things that's different too is that traditionally, when you had like the salt hay farmers and like other farmers who would dike the marshes and control the water more, I always hear a lot of old timers say, well, during that time period, it was the banks were better, everything was, so in that way, apparently, the human meddling made it better. But of course, once they could no longer maintain the dikes or the sluice gates and everything else, then I think that really accelerated when they had to abandon that practice. And then of course, as you know, once water starts doing its thing, it's hard to slow that up. So natural in that sense, that it wasn't that we built things up and made it happen that way. Yeah.
What were the height years of the oyster industry in that area?
Really the 1920s. The roaring 20s. Because during that time period, from the mid to late 20s, they built a lot more oyster schooners. That's when our boat, the Aging Gerwald, was built. They start building boats that are about twice the size of the old boats, so they could catch more oysters. And in 1927, they call it the Great Set, and that's when the oysters spawn. They really reproduce and go crazy, and there's a lot of oysters out there, and that holds everybody for a few years. But everything really like would fluctuate like every 7 years. Like every 7 years there would be like a good set of oysters, and it would be good, start to go down, and then another good set. And that pattern continued until 1957 when MSX, the parasite, came and really destroyed the oysters. But things are doing pretty well now with the natural growth oysters. It's a very managed fishery. A quota is set every year that both the oystermen and the state and Rutgers are all on the table, and they review the data and look at the mortality rates of oysters. And it's pretty amazing when you hear them all talk about how much time they spend thinking about these oysters and how to continue to grow the oyster population. And then of course you have all the oyster farmers as well. That's not part of the quota. So yeah, there's a lot going on. Of course, oysters are such a beneficial critter because each oyster filters up to 50 gallons of water a day. The reefs that they make, help with erosion, help protect the mainland, and of course the reefs provide habitat for a lot of other critters. So even if you don't like to eat them, they're a good critter to have.
And were they mostly canning them, or were they shipping them out more fresh? The railroads were
Yes, good question. In the early days, like when our building was built in the early 20th century, they called it the shell trade, and they kept the oyster meat in the shell. They would put them into sacks or barrels, and then that got loaded into the train cars and then shipped all over the country. Then in the mid-1920s or so, due to outbreaks of typhoid fever, the industry nationwide has to change. And originally, the kind of folklore said, well, it wasn't our oysters that was the problem. It was milk out of Chicago that caused the typhoid. But since then, I've read more about it, and we can blame the Long Island oysters for the typhoid. But because what they would do is they would take the oysters, they'd harvest them from the, move them from the bay or from up the bay, plant them on their grounds, let them grow a couple of years, dredge them up, bring them up the river, and they would put them into what are called floats, and they were like these like holding tanks that lined the river. They put the oysters in there, in the river, which of course were downstream from like Millville, that had a lot of industry going on and so forth. And of course the oysters are filter feeders, so they're taking in everything. But the reason why the oystermen did that is because then the oysters could clean themselves out. Because they would leave them in there for a day or two. They would take in that brackish water, and they would retain water, so they would puff themselves up a bit more. So then when they were packed up, they could survive, during winter time, because they had to be alive, upon arrival. So you cook them or eat them. So they could get to Chicago or Denver, and because they had retained that water. So once the typhoid issue happens, then that is banned, the floating of oysters, and that's when you start getting, when the shucking aspect is put into play. So then they can, clean out the oysters and do that process, in the packing house. And that's when you completely see the labor force change, where you have African American migrant workers coming out from the Chesapeake to work the oyster houses. So a big change during that time. But yes. And now in Bivalve, there's an example of both. We have one shucking house and we have one packing house. So we have both historic examples still happening today. Any other questions? Now it's dark out. Good. Well, I did promise you 2 tickets for a boat that doesn't exist in me.
But it's going to be really nice when it comes back.
Yes. In fact, if you go to our website,
A lot of new wood, though.
yes, everything from the water line up. So it's a lot of, but yeah, the shipwrights are doing a beautiful job. And if you go to our website or go to our Facebook page, you can go to AJ Mearwald. There's a lot of cool pictures of the work that the shipwrights have been doing in Maine. So yeah, she's going to be really, really beautiful, when she's done. So good. Do you have do you have a question in mind, or should I just think of a question to ask to whoever wants to win the tickets? Or
Think of the question by all means.
oh, you think of a question? Now I've thrown so much information at you. What county is Bivalve located in? Oh, let me answer all of this. What's that?
Salem or Cumberland County?
Cumberland, there you go, ding, ding. Yes, Cumberland County. So, yeah. But yeah, please come down and visit us sometime. I know some of you already do on a regular basis, or, you know, in the future, you know, doing a program on the boat.
The cafe's running.
Huh?
The cafe is running, not at the moment.
No.
When did you stop the excursions for the children? When did you stop the?
Oh, because of COVID. Because of COVID.
Oh, so is that going to continue after?
Yes, well, we actually have like 5 school groups that are coming for field trips this
Okay.
spring, but we don't have a boat. So we're going to do activities in our museum and on
Because
land.
the children love that.
I know. So then next spring we'll go back to that. So it will be a long time since we've done that. But yeah, 2019 was our biggest season. With the number of people we had on board, people coming to our museum, the number of field trips. It was like, wow.
We technically still have 2 boats on site. We have the boathouse and we have the cashier. That's,
Oh, right, yes, the cashier, remnants of the boat. And we have some smaller vessels too, smaller skiffs too. And we have a really neat collection. We have the oyster history and local history. Good, well, thank you so much for inviting me and